The story of humanity's beginning. Chapter 1. The Dawn. In the depths of ancient forests, among the tall trees and whispering winds, lived a small group of people. Their eyes were filled with wild wisdom, accumulated over generations spent in constant struggle with nature. These people did not yet know what civilization was, but their instincts, sense of community, and ability to adapt to harsh conditions made them the precursors of those who would later build great cities. Kain, the strong and determined leader, was at the center of their world. His face, lined with wrinkles and hardened by the winds, was a symbol of survival for his tribe. Every day he went out hunting, and every evening he returned to the fire to share the catch with the others. His eyes, deep-set and always vigilant, saw more than just the forest. They saw the future he wanted to build for his people, though he did not yet know how to speak of it. Leah, his companion, possessed the gift of foresight. Her clear eyes could penetrate the fog of uncertainty and see what others could not. She not only supported Kain in his endeavors, but also guided his decisions when he was in doubt. Leah sensed that their path was not limited to mere survival. She saw ahead the possibility of development, the possibility of creating something greater than just a tribe. One evening, as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in bloody hues, Leah approached Kain. Her face was serious, and her eyes full of concern. "We cannot stay here much longer," she whispered. "The forest is becoming too crowded, the animals are moving further away, and our children do not see a future." Kain listened silently, his thoughts occupied with the same concerns. He knew that the tribe was becoming too large for this territory. The food supplies were dwindling, and the hunters were returning empty-handed more and more often. It was time to seek new lands. The next day, Kain announced his decision to the tribe. "We will head west," he said, his voice firm. "Beyond the mountains, there is a land where rivers are full of fish and forests are full of game. There, we can build a new home." Inon, a young hunter, was among those who listened to Kain. A fire ignited in his heart. This was his chance to prove his worth. Inon always aspired to more than just hunting. He wanted to contribute to the tribe's future, to show that the younger generation was as valuable as the experienced elders. The tribe began to prepare for the journey. They left behind the places they had known, tearing themselves away from the roots that had nourished their lives for generations. This transition was the first step toward a new beginning, the dawn of a new era. As they walked, the forest grew thicker, and the road ahead was full of unknowns. But each step was a step toward the future, and in these steps echoed the voices of those who would one day take the first steps in creating civilization. The group moved forward, carrying not only their lives, but also the seeds of the future yet to be seen. Chapter 2. The journey westward proved more difficult than the tribes had anticipated. Dense forests gave way to open plains, and the rivers they crossed became wider and more treacherous. But with each day, with each step forward, they discovered something new. One evening at sunset, when the sun was just touching the horizon and the sky was painted in fiery colors, the tribe stumbled upon a strange place. Before them stretched a valley surrounded by high cliffs from which crystal-clear streams flowed. The air was filled with the scents of unfamiliar plants, and hidden within this valley was something they had never seen before. Asha, the tribe's elder, froze for a moment, staring at the ground beneath his feet. He noticed strange stones, unlike any he had seen before. They were heavier than usual, and when struck against each other, they produced sparks. This was unusual, and Asha realized that these stones could be crucial for their survival. That evening, as the tribe gathered around the fires, Asha approached Kain and showed him the discovery. "These are not just stones," he said, grinding one of them in his hands. "Look." He struck stone against stone, and suddenly a spark flashed. "With these, we can start fires." Kain pondered this. Fire was one of the most important aspects of their lives. It provided warmth, protected them from predators, and allowed them to cook food. But until now, they had struggled to start it, relying on luck and friction between wood. If these stones could simplify the process, it would be a significant breakthrough. The next day, Asha gathered a group of hunters and went to the valley. They searched for similar stones and returned with full hands. That evening, There was unusual excitement around the fire. People learned how to use the new stones, and with each attempt, the fire ignited faster and brighter. Liao watched this with a slight smile. She felt that these discoveries were leading them to something greater. In her dreams, she increasingly saw visions of new knowledge, new skills that could change their lives. One night, she approached Kain and suggested something new. "We could try growing plants," she said. "I've seen seeds fall to the ground and sprout. What if we planted them ourselves and harvested?" Kain didn't immediately understand her idea. "But we are hunters," he replied. "We are used to gathering food in the forest, not waiting for it to grow. But what if we could control this process?" Liao persisted. "Then we could harvest more food and not rely on the luck of the hunt." The idea was bold, but Kain felt that there was sense in Leah's words. He proposed trying on a small plot of land near the river. They chose a patch of earth, cleared it of stones and weeds, and began planting the seeds they had found in the valley. The first results were not immediate. The soil was stubborn, and the tribe doubted whether it was worth continuing. But Leah did not give up. Every day she cared for the tiny sprouts, believing that their hard work would bear fruit. And then one day, when the morning sun bathed the valley in its light, the first green shoots appeared in the field. People gathered around and gazed at this miracle. A new hope ignited in their hearts. They realized that their future depended not only on hunting but also on what they could create themselves. With each day, the tribe learned something new. They discovered other types of plants, tried new methods of cultivation. Gradually, their diet became more varied, and food supplies increased. This gave them the confidence that they could survive in any conditions. But with new discoveries came new challenges. The tribe faced unpredictable weather, pests that threatened their crops. They learned to combat these difficulties using new knowledge and skills. The journey westward opened up a world full of opportunities, but also a world that demanded constant learning and adaptation. And each new day brought new discoveries that made them stronger and wiser. Chapter 3. Community and Culture. Several seasons had passed since the tribe settled in the valley. Their new settlement was becoming more organized, and life began to change. The transition from constant wandering to a settled way of life led to the development of new social bonds and customs, which became the foundation for future culture. Kain watched with satisfaction as his people built their homes, constructed more solid huts from stone and wood, and as small children ran across the fields, playing with the first domesticated animals. But he also understood that to maintain order in the growing community, rules and traditions were necessary. One evening, as the tribe gathered around the fires, Asha proposed an idea. His wise voice, respected by all the tribe members, said, "We are no longer just a group of people. We have become a community. But to continue developing, we need more than just hunting and gathering. We need stories, customs, and laws that will be passed down from generation to generation." These words struck a chord in the hearts of all those present. The tribe had already begun to feel the need for something greater than just living together. They needed spiritual unity that would bind them together and give meaning to their existence. Liao suggested starting with stories. Each of us has our own memories, our own lessons learned from life. Let's gather them together and create something that will remind us of who we are and where we came from. In the following weeks, the tribe gathered around the fire in the evenings, and each person shared their story. These stories told of hunting large beasts, battles with other tribes, and searches for new lands. Some stories were full of joy, others of sorrow, but each of them helped form the tribe's collective identity. Soon, Asha suggested creating the first symbols that could convey these stories to future generations. He began carving images on stones and wood, depicting scenes from their lives. These symbols became the first elements of a new culture that began to form within their tribe. Over time, these symbols transformed into full-fledged rituals. People began to mark the changing seasons, celebrate successful hunts and harvests, and mourn losses. These rituals united them and helped create a sense of community that became the foundation for future traditions and beliefs. One such ritual was the ritual of fire. Every evening before going to rest, the tribe would gather around a large fire. At that moment, Asha would tell ancient stories, passing down the wisdom of the ancestors. while Leah conducted a ritual of gratitude for the fire that protected and warmed them. As new customs developed, new social roles also emerged. Inon, the young hunter, gradually became a leader among the youth. He organized hunts and taught young warriors the skills he had mastered over the years. He was respected for his strength and ingenuity, and his influence on the tribe grew. But with each new achievement and discovery, the tribe also faced new challenges. Their new knowledge and cultural achievements began to attract the attention of neighboring tribes who lived nearby. These tribes saw them as a threat, but also as a source of valuable knowledge. One morning at dawn, the tribe was visited by strangers. The newcomers arrived unarmed, but with expressions of caution on their faces. They were fewer in number, but they clearly possessed some important knowledge that could be valuable to both tribes. Kain and Leah met them with caution, but also with openness to dialogue. These people brought with them their own stories and customs, and in their eyes, one could see respect for the achievements of Kain's tribe. It soon became clear that sharing knowledge and traditions could benefit both peoples. Thus, Kain proposed an exchange. They could learn from each other, sharing their achievements and knowledge. This became the first step towards forming a more complex and extensive network of interactions between tribes, which would eventually lead to the emergence of larger communities and cultures. So began a new phase in the tribe's life. They not only survived, but also began to form the foundation for future civilization. And every new ritual, every new story, every new alliance became bricks in the construction of what would later become humanity's greatest achievements. Chapter 4. Conflict and Unification. The tribe of Kain gradually expanded its influence in the valley. Their knowledge, skills, and culture began to attract the attention of neighboring tribes. Some of these tribes sought peace and cooperation, while others saw Kain's tribe as a threat to their territories and way of life. This tension inevitably led to the first serious conflict. On a cool autumn day, when the wind whispered of the coming winter, the tribe faced a threat head-on. A group of warriors from a neighboring tribe, led by their chief Narek, arrived at the borders of Kain's territory. Their faces were grim, and their hands gripped their weapons tightly. They had not come for trade or the exchange of knowledge. Kain, along with Inon and other elders, stepped forward to meet them. He understood that this moment could determine the fate of his people. Narek, a large and ruthless man, wasted no time on pleasantries. "You have taken our land," he said, his voice like thunder. "Your tribe has grown too large. You threaten our existence. We have come to reclaim what is ours." Kain responded calmly but firmly, "We do not want war. We seek only to live in peace and prosperity. But if you believe we have encroached on your territory, let us discuss how we can coexist." But Narek was not inclined to negotiate. His tribe, unlike Kain's, lived in constant struggle for resources. They knew nothing of the rituals that had united Kain's people. They saw only weakness in them. For them, strength and power were the only means of survival. Conflict was inevitable. Narek's warriors charged, and the battle began. Kain and Inon fought alongside their people, defending their lands and families. The battle was fierce, and both sides suffered losses. But Kain's tribe, armed with new knowledge and cohesion, prevailed. However, the victory came at a great cost. Many were wounded, and several warriors were killed. Leah, who had watched the battle from a hill, felt her heart break for each of the fallen. She knew that the peace they dreamed of had not yet been achieved. When the battle was over, Narek, wounded but unbroken, rose from the ground. He understood that he could no longer win, but his pride would not allow him to ask for mercy. "You are strong, Kain," he said bitterly, "but remember my words. There will never be peace between our tribes." Kain approached him and, unexpectedly, extended his hand. "Peace is possible, Narek. We can help each other. Your people can join us, and together we will be stronger." These words were unexpected for Narek. He looked at Kain's hand for a long time, pondering what to do. His pride and hatred struggled with reason and intuition, which told him that an alliance could be beneficial. In the end, he took Kain's hand. This gesture became a symbol of reconciliation and the beginning of a new phase for both tribes. Instead of continuing the war, they decided to unite their forces. Narek's tribe brought with them their knowledge and experience, which helped Kain's tribe better cope with difficulties. In return, they gained access to the resources and knowledge that Kain's people had developed. This unification became the first step towards creating a more complex and cohesive society. They began to build larger and more fortified settlements, develop trade with other tribes, and exchange cultural and spiritual practices. Over time, their community became the first nascent civilization. Leah played a key role in this unification. Her foresight and intuition helped to establish relations between the two peoples. She proposed creating joint rituals that would mark important events in their lives, strengthening the unity between the tribes. One such ritual became the ritual of the waters. Each year, when the rivers in the valley began to swell after the snowmelt, both tribes would gather by the water. They conducted a purification and renewal ritual, praying for peace and fertility. This ritual became a symbol of their unity and shared purpose. Despite the difficult path to unification, it marked the beginning of a new era. The conflicts that once divided them became the foundation for growth and development. The tribes of Kain and Narek realized that only through cooperation and understanding could they create a future that belonged to all. Thus ended the phase of conflicts and began the period of unification, which laid the foundation for the first nascent civilization. Chapter 5. The Path to Civilization. The unification of Kain's tribe and Narek's tribe marked a turning point in the history of early humanity. From that moment, their lives began to change rapidly. New alliances, new knowledge, and new challenges became an integral part of their existence, and they embarked on the path to creating the first nascent civilization. The first few years after the unification were spent in intense work. It was difficult to overcome the distrust and disagreements between the two tribes, but the necessity of survival and the desire for prosperity united their efforts. Both groups understood that only through joint efforts could they ensure a future for themselves. Kain became the chief leader of this new community. His wisdom and strength helped maintain a balance between the interests of all members of the Union. He understood that to create a strong society, not only laws and customs were needed, but also a clear understanding of the goals they should strive for. One of the main tasks was the creation of a system of exchange. Narek's tribe had skills in stone and woodwork, which they were eager to share, while Kain's tribe brought their knowledge in agriculture and animal husbandry. Gradually, internal trade between the two peoples was established, leading to the development of an economy. During this time, Leah played a crucial role in the spiritual and cultural life of the new society. She created the first belief system based on observations of natural phenomena and rituals that united the people. She taught them to honor the forces of nature and see them not just as enemies or allies, but as part of a larger plan that helped them survive and develop. Inon, who had become an experienced hunter and warrior, took responsibility for protecting and expanding the community's territory. He organized groups of young warriors who patrolled the surrounding areas, protecting crops and herds from wild animals and potential invasions by other tribes. Under his leadership, the construction of the first defensive structures began, walls and fortifications that became a symbol of the new civilization. Over time, the settlement grew. The huts, which were once scattered across the valley, were now arranged in orderly rows. The first public buildings appeared, places where people gathered to discuss important matters, conduct rituals, and learn. Asha, the elder and sage, watched as his tribe transformed. He decided to pass on his knowledge and experience to the new generations. Asha began teaching young people the basics of writing, using symbols and drawings that he carved on stones and wood. This was the beginning of literacy, a way of transmitting knowledge and experience that became the foundation for the development of more complex forms of communication. But with the growth of society came new problems. Gradually, disagreements began to arise over the distribution of resources, power, and status. Some elders from Narek's tribe began to express dissatisfaction with the fact that their traditions and customs were being sidelined. This led to the first political conflicts within the community. Kain understood that it was necessary to find a way to maintain peace and justice in society. He proposed the creation of a council of elders, which would represent the interests of all parts of the community and make decisions based on discussion and consensus. This council became the first prototype of governance based on cooperation and fairness. The council of elders included representatives from both Kain's tribe and Narek's tribe. Each had a voice, and important decisions were made only after thorough discussion. This innovation helped maintain order and avoid serious conflicts. Gradually, these decisions became the foundation for the creation of the first laws that regulated life in the community. These laws concerned the distribution of land, rights to water, trade, and the treatment of those who broke the rules. They became the foundation on which the entire society was built. Thus, what began as an alliance of two tribes gradually turned into the first nascent civilization. People, united by a common goal and belief in the future, began to realize their ability not only to survive but also to create something new, great, and lasting. But greater challenges lay ahead. The world they were building required constant renewal and strengthening to withstand not only internal disagreements but also external threats that loomed from distant lands. Chapter 6. New Horizons. Years passed since Kain's tribe and Nerek's tribe united and laid the foundation for the first civilization. Their settlement became prosperous, and culture and knowledge spread far beyond the valley. But with the growth of the community and the development of technologies came the realization that the world they lived in was much wider and more complex than they had ever imagined. It all began with the sudden arrival of travelers from distant lands. These people, covered in the dust of long roads, came from another tribe that no one in the valley had even heard of. They spoke an unfamiliar language and had strange customs, but their arrival sparked interest among Kain and Nerek's people. Kain met them with caution, but also with openness to new things. He understood that these travelers might bring knowledge and technologies that could help their society develop further. The travelers, in turn, were amazed by what they saw. Orderly rows of huts, a developed trade system, and strong walls protecting the settlement. They brought news of other tribes living beyond the valley, of distant lands where rivers flowed faster and forests stretched to the horizon. They told of tribes that had learned to smelt metals and make tools from them, of great hunters whose skills surpassed everything Kain and Nerek's people knew. These stories ignited the imagination and ambitions of the people. They began to realize that their world was just a small part of a much larger world, full of opportunities and challenges. This realization led to a decision that would change their fate forever. The Council of Elders decided to send a group of explorers to search for new lands and knowledge. Inon, who by then had become one of the most respected warriors and leaders among the youth, was chosen to lead this expedition. His experience and determination made him the ideal candidate for this mission. Inon, feeling the responsibility and anticipation of a new adventure, gathered a small but experienced team of hunters, craftsmen, and sages. Before they left, Liao blessed them for good luck, and Asha gave them ancient symbols that were meant to protect them on their journey and help them find their way home. The expedition set out to the east, where, according to the travelers, lay great lands full of exotic animals and unfamiliar plants. The journey was not easy. They encountered wild beasts, crossed turbulent rivers, and climbed high mountains. But each new day brought new discoveries and strengthened their resolve. One day, after weeks of wandering, they stumbled upon vast plains where the land was fertile, and the air was fresh and filled with the scents of herbs. There were no signs of other tribes here, and Inon decided that this place was perfect for founding new settlements. He sent messengers back to the city to inform them of his discovery. Soon, the first groups of settlers began to arrive from the city, bringing with them everything they needed to build new homes and cultivate the land. These people were full of enthusiasm and faith in the future. They knew they were not just building a new city, but a new life. Meanwhile, Inon continued to explore the surrounding lands. He discovered that to the west, beyond the forests, lay a great desert, but beyond it were mountains that might hide rich resources. Inon understood that for the further expansion of their civilization, they would need to conquer even the harshest territories. When the news of the great expansion reached the city, it inspired people to new achievements. The Council of Elders decided that it was necessary to strengthen the connections between the new settlements and develop trade. They proposed building the first roads that would connect all their lands and allow people to move freely, share knowledge and resources. These roads became a symbol of their unity and determination. Gradually, regular caravans were established between the settlements, carrying goods, news, and culture. In these new cities, crafts and arts began to flourish, and the first steps were taken in creating written laws and governance. But not everything was smooth. As their civilization expanded, new challenges arose. Not all the tribes living in these lands were happy with their presence. Some saw them as invaders, which led to conflicts. Inon understood that for survival and prosperity, they needed not only to defend themselves but also to learn to negotiate, to find common ground with other peoples. Thus, the first diplomatic missions began. Kain and the Council of Elders sent envoys to neighboring tribes, offering them alliances and trade. These missions were difficult. Not everyone agreed to cooperate, but some tribes saw in the new alliances an opportunity for their own development. Leah, meanwhile, proposed using knowledge of nature and magical rituals to establish contact with tribes that believed in the forces of nature. She suggested conducting joint rituals that would strengthen trust between the peoples. This decision bore fruit, and soon some tribes began to join their alliance. As a result of the Great Expansion, the people of Kain and Narek not only increased their territories, but also became a true civilization that included different cultures, traditions, and knowledge. They understood that their strength lay in diversity, that each tribe, each person could contribute to the common cause. But despite all the successes, even greater challenges awaited them. The world around them continued to change, and new challenges required even more courage and wisdom. The great roads they had laid led them to new horizons, but now they had to decide whether they could maintain their unity and continue to develop in this new, ever-changing world. Chapter 7. The Test of Time. Decades passed since Kain's and Narek's tribes united and began their great journey on the path to civilization. Their settlement had grown into a thriving city, surrounded by strong walls, with numerous workshops, fields, and markets. People lived better than ever before, and the world seemed stable and secure. But beneath the surface of this prosperity, new, more complex challenges were brewing that required not only wisdom but also innovation. It all began with the first signs of climate change. Winters became longer and harsher, summers shorter and hotter. The rivers that once teemed with fish and provided water for the fields began to dry up. Harvests were becoming less abundant, and food supplies quickly dwindled. Kain, now an esteemed elder, saw his people beginning to lose confidence in the future. He understood that overcoming these difficulties would require not only strength and endurance, but also the wisdom his people had learned over the years. Together with Leah and Inon, he began to develop a plan that would help their civilization survive in these changing conditions. The first step was the introduction of strict resource distribution norms. The Council of Elders decreed that every member of society should receive a certain share of food and water to avoid hunger and internal conflict. This decision was met with resistance, especially from the wealthy and influential families who were used to abundance. But Kain insisted that the survival of the entire community depended on fair distribution. Meanwhile, Inon set out on new expeditions to find other lands where the climate might be more favorable for life. He and his team explored distant lands, moving further south and east, but everywhere they encountered the same problems: droughts, depleted soils, and food shortages. Leah, meanwhile, focused on the spiritual side of society's life. She understood that people needed faith and hope to overcome difficult times. Her rituals and ceremonies, which once helped unite the community, now became even more significant. She proposed a new belief system based on respect for the forces of nature and understanding the cycles of life. People began to make offerings to the spirits of the earth and water, praying for mercy and protection. But despite all their efforts, the situation continued to worsen. People began to leave their homes in search of a better life, and the number of those who remained in the city dwindled. This led to new conflicts and disagreements. Some elders began to doubt the wisdom of the decisions made by Kain and his team, and they offered their own solutions to the problem. At this time, refugees from other tribes, who had faced the same difficulties, began to flock to the city. They sought refuge and help, but their presence only exacerbated the tension. The city was on the verge of breaking. Resources were dwindling, and the number of people was growing. Some began to suggest closing the city gates and letting no one in to preserve the remaining supplies for their own. But Kain, Leah, and Inon understood that isolation was not the solution. They knew that only by uniting all people, regardless of their origin, could they save their civilization. They proposed opening the city gates to all in need of help and creating a unified society where everyone would contribute to the common cause. This decision sparked heated debates. Many feared that the influx of new people would only worsen the situation, but in the end, the Council of Elders agreed with Kain's proposal. The city opened its gates, and people began to build new homes, create new farms, and workshops. But this was only the beginning. The city faced the need to adapt to new conditions and find new ways of survival. Asha, the elder and keeper of knowledge, proposed using ancient irrigation methods they had found in the ruins of forgotten civilizations. These methods allowed them to conserve water and use it efficiently for growing new crops. Meanwhile, Lia proposed conducting a series of expeditions to the sea, of which they had heard from travelers. She believed that there they could find new sources of food and water that would help their people survive. Inon agreed to lead this mission, and together with a group of explorers, he set out for the sea. Their journey was long and full of dangers, but in the end, they reached the coast. There they found an abundance of fish and other sea creatures that could become a new source of food for their people. They also found new plants and trees that could be used for construction and other needs. When Inon returned to the city with this news, people felt a new hope. The city began to recover. The new irrigation methods allowed for increased harvests, and fish and seafood became an important part of their diet. Gradually, the city began to grow and prosper again. This test of time taught them an important lesson. Survival depends not only on strength and resources, but also on the ability to adapt, learn, and unite in the face of difficulties. The city of Kain and Narek became a symbol of resilience and wisdom, an example of how people can overcome any trials if they act together. But greater challenges still lay ahead. The world continued to change, and new challenges demanded even greater courage and wisdom. The journey of humanity had only just begun. Chapter 8. The Great Expansion. The city of Kain and Narek, having survived difficult times and emerging stronger and more united, found itself on the threshold of a new stage of development. The people, having realized the importance of unity and adaptation, were determined not only to survive but to thrive in this changing world. But to reach new heights, they needed to expand their horizons, venture beyond the familiar, and explore the unknown lands. With each passing year, resources in the valley became increasingly limited, and despite Inon's successful expeditions to the sea, it was clear that the city needed new lands for settlement and development. The Council of Elders decided that the time had come for the Great Expansion, a mission to explore and settle new territories that could secure the future of their people. Kain, understanding the importance of this step, began preparing his people for the long journeys ahead. He entrusted Inon with leading expeditions to the south and west, to lands they knew only from travelers' tales and sparse information from refugees. These lands were full of unknown dangers, but also held enormous potential. Inon gathered the best warriors and explorers who were ready to venture into the farthest reaches. They were equipped with new tools, created thanks to the knowledge gained from ancient ruins and the ability to smelt metals, which they had mastered in recent years. The expedition was prepared for both encounters with new tribes and confrontations with the elements. Before their departure, Lia conducted a blessing ceremony. She called upon the spirits of the earth and sky to protect Inon and his people on their journey. Her words were full of hope and confidence that these expeditions would open new opportunities for their people. The first months of the journey were full of surprises. As the expedition moved further, they encountered increasingly strange phenomena. In the forests, they found wild beasts they had never seen before, and the rivers, once teeming with life, now carried dead fish and dark waters. But the most frightening was the feeling that something was watching them, something invisible yet powerful. On the 7th day of their journey, they reached a border where the forest suddenly gave way to a desert stretching to the horizon. But this was no ordinary desert. It was filled with strange structures, half buried in the sand, and the air here was filled with a faint but palpable electric charge. Inon realized that they were standing before something far beyond their understanding. They began exploring these structures and soon realized that they were the remnants of an ancient, long-forgotten civilization that might have been even more advanced than their own. These ruins were full of mysteries, strange mechanisms that had long since ceased to function but still held traces of their former power. inscriptions on the walls that no one could read, and symbols that reminded them of the warnings left in the ancient ruins they had found earlier. In the center of these ruins, they found enormous gates made of a strange material they had never seen before. The gates were locked, but along their edges pulsed a faint light that created the sensation that these gates were not just an artifact but could be a portal to something greater. Inon understood that they were on the verge of a great discovery, but also of great danger. He decided not to attempt to open the gates until he returned to the city and discussed with the Council of Elders what to do next. When Inon and his team returned home, they brought with them not only stories of what they had seen, but also samples of artifacts and writings found in the ruins. These discoveries sparked enormous interest among all the city's residents, especially Asha, who had dedicated his life to studying ancient knowledge. The Council of Elders gathered for an emergency meeting. The discussion was tense. Some saw these gates as a threat and warned against attempting to open them, while others, on the contrary, believed that they could be the key to new knowledge and opportunities. Leah, who had always been the voice of intuition and spiritual guidance, suggested seeking the advice of nature's forces. She conducted a complex ceremony, during which she tried to communicate with the spirits of the ancients. In her vision, she saw that the gates could lead to something beyond their understanding, to immense power as well as to immense danger. In the end, the council decided that the gates should be thoroughly studied, but with extreme caution. It was decided to send scientists and engineers there to understand the nature of these gates and attempt to decipher the writings left by the ancients. Inon once again led this mission, but this time he was not alone. With him went the best minds of their civilization to unravel the mysteries of the ancients. The research took months, and finally, they realized that the gates could indeed be opened, but it required special knowledge they did not yet possess. But despite all the warnings, curiosity and the thirst for knowledge prevailed. A decision was made to try to open the gates. On the day of the opening, the entire city stood in anticipation. Everyone knew that this was a moment that would change their lives forever, for better or worse. When the gates finally opened, the world around them changed. A tremendous force was unleashed, and before them opened a new world, filled with incredible wonders and unpredictable dangers. This moment became the point of no return, the beginning of a new era for their civilization, an era of great discoveries and great trials. Now they had to learn what lay beyond these gates and how it would change their future. They stood on the threshold of a great adventure, but no one could predict where it would lead. Once these gates were opened, they could not stop. New worlds and new horizons awaited them, but so did new dangers that could either elevate their civilization to unprecedented heights or lead to its destruction. Chapter 9. The Gates of the Future. The opening of the mysterious gates marked the beginning of a new era for the civilization of Kain and Nera. These gates, leading to an unknown world, beckoned with both opportunity and danger. After much debate and preparation, a decision was made to send a group of explorers beyond the gates to understand what lay on the other side. Inon, who had already proven his bravery and dedication to his people many times, led this expedition. His team included the best warriors, scientists, and engineers. Leah, whose spiritual guidance had always played an important role in decision-making, blessed them for a successful journey, reminding them to remember their origins and roots. Passing through the gates, the team found themselves in a world completely different from anything they knew. The space beyond the gates was filled with strange and unusual phenomena. Plants that glowed in the dark, animals with incredible forms and sizes, and a landscape that seemed somehow different from their own world. This was a place where the laws of nature worked differently, and every step was filled with the unknown. In the first days of the journey, they explored the surroundings, recording everything they saw. The scientists tried to understand the nature of this world, comparing it to what they knew. They discovered that here time and space were perceived differently. Day could suddenly turn into night, and distances that seemed short stretched into long hours of travel. At some point, as they moved further, they stumbled upon ruins that reminded them of the structures found in the desert before the gates. This was a sign that once there had been a civilization here, possibly even more advanced than their own. In these ruins, they found artifacts that they could not explain. Strange mechanisms that seemed to still work, and inscriptions on the walls that no one could read. One of the scientists studying these inscriptions suggested that they might contain warnings or instructions, but despite all efforts, their meaning remained a mystery. At this time, Inon began to feel growing anxiety. He knew they were on the verge of great discoveries, but he also felt that these discoveries could hide something terrifying. Soon, the team began to face the first problems. Some members of the expedition started complaining of strange dreams and visions. These visions were filled with symbols and images they could not explain, but they made them feel anxious. They saw scenes of destruction and chaos, and each time these dreams became more and more real. Leah, who had remained in the city, also began to feel uneasy. Her connection with the spirits and intuitive perception told her that something was wrong. She tried to communicate with Inon through rituals, but her visions were filled with fog and uncertainty. She understood that they had entered a place where their previous knowledge and powers might be powerless. Meanwhile, Inon and his team continued to explore the world beyond the gates. They found vast fields where incredible plants once grew, but now these lands were dead and barren. This heightened their anxiety. What could have caused such destruction? They began to realize that the civilization that once existed here had faced something that led to its downfall. One day, while exploring one of the largest ruins, they came upon a huge hall where battle and destruction scenes were depicted on the walls. In the center of the hall was a massive object resembling an altar or portal. The scientists began to study this object, trying to understand its purpose. But as soon as they approached, the room began to fill with strange light, and the air started to tremble with an invisible force. At that moment, Inon felt that their presence here had disturbed some balance. He gave the order to retreat, but it was already too late. The force hidden in these ruins had awakened. Suddenly, strange phenomena began to occur. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, the walls started to crumble, and the air was filled with an unbearable sound, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Inon and his team rushed back to the gates, but on their way, they began to encounter creatures they had never seen before. These creatures seemed to be born of chaos itself. Their bodies constantly changed, they were like shadows, yet incredibly dangerous. The warriors fought to protect the scientists, but every step back to the gates was a struggle. When they finally reached the gates, Inon saw that they were beginning to close, as if something on this side was trying to prevent their return. At the last moment, with desperate determination, Inon and his team rushed through the gates. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the gates slammed shut behind them with a deafening sound, leaving the world behind them in absolute silence. Inon and his people returned to their world, but they were no longer the same. They brought back knowledge and fears that were now part of their civilization. The gates were closed, but the question of what they had awakened and what it meant for their people remained. Now they faced a new challenge: to understand how to use what they had learned and how to protect themselves from what lay behind those gates. The city, once prosperous and confident in its future, now stood on the brink of uncertainty. The great civilization that had begun its ascent with the union of two tribes now had to learn to live with what it had discovered and prepare for the inevitable challenges. Chapter 10. Beyond the Gates. The discovery of the gates had marked the beginning of a new era for the civilization of Kain and Nera. These gates, leading to an unknown world, held both the promise of great potential and the shadow of immense danger. After months of discussion and preparation, the Council of Elders decided to continue studying the gates, attempting to control the forces that lay beyond them. Inon, who had led the first expedition through the gates, understood the gravity of the situation better than anyone. He knew that their civilization had embarked on a path that offered no return. The gates were not just a doorway to another world, but a gateway to powers beyond their understanding. As the scientists and engineers continued to study the artifacts and technologies found beyond the gates, they made significant progress. They developed defensive systems that could contain the unstable energy of the artifacts and even began using some of that energy to improve life in the city. However, with each new discovery, anxiety grew. The gates, which had once been merely a passage to another realm, now seemed to be something far more complex and dangerous. Inon felt this growing unease more acutely with each passing day. He, more than anyone, understood the potential risks that lay ahead. While some saw the discoveries beyond the gates as a new source of power, others, including Lia, began to notice increasingly strange and unsettling signs. Lia continued to perform rituals, trying to understand what was happening beyond their perception. Her visions became darker and more confusing. She saw destruction, darkness consuming light, and people losing their souls in their attempts to control what they could not fully comprehend. One day, during another experiment with the gates, a catastrophic incident occurred that turned everything upside down. During an attempt to activate one of the artifacts found beyond the gates, a powerful surge of energy was unleashed. The protective systems failed, and the gates began to emit a strange radiation that quickly spread throughout the city. People began experiencing strange symptoms. Some lost consciousness, others began seeing bizarre visions, and still others felt an overwhelming sense of fear. Inon and his team immediately tried to shut down the artifact, but it was too late. The radiation spread throughout the city, disrupting all mechanisms and causing mass panic. The city descended into chaos as people began fleeing their homes, fearing for their lives. Kain, who had remained at the heart of the events, tried to maintain order. He gathered all the elders and leaders to discuss the situation. It was clear that they could no longer control what they had unleashed. The question now was how to save their people and prevent a catastrophe. Lia, who by this time had felt a connection with the forces awakened beyond the gates, proposed conducting a sealing ritual. She believed that if they could communicate with the spirits of the ancients, they could find a way to close the gates and seal them forever, preventing further spread of the threat. However, Inon, who had been at the forefront of the scientific research, understood that simply closing the gates might not solve the problem. He proposed a radical plan: to destroy the gates and everything associated with them to eliminate the threat once and for all. But this also meant that they could lose all the knowledge and technology they had gained. The council was divided. Some supported Inon, believing that destroying the gates was the only way to avoid total catastrophe, while others, including Lia, believed they should try to find a peaceful solution through spiritual practices and rituals. In the end, it was decided to attempt both approaches. Lia began preparations for the sealing ritual, gathering all her followers and sages. Meanwhile, Inon and his team began preparing to destroy the gates in case the ritual failed. The night of the ritual was filled with tension and fear. The city was enveloped in anxious anticipation. Lia, surrounded by her helpers, began the complex ritual, calling upon the spirits of the ancients for help. The air was thick with energy, and it seemed that nature itself had paused in expectation. But at the moment when the ritual reached its climax, something unexpected happened. The gates began to vibrate, and an enormous wave of energy burst forth from them. Lia and her followers were knocked off their feet by this force, and it became clear that the ritual had not succeeded. Seeing this, Inon gave the order to begin the destruction of the gates. They activated a mechanism that was supposed to bring down the structure of the gates and destroy the artifacts. But at the moment the mechanism was triggered, the gates began to open, releasing something that was never meant to enter their world. From the gates emerged strange creatures, manifestations of darkness and chaos. They resembled the beings Inon had seen in the world beyond the gates, but now they seemed even more powerful and terrifying. They began to spread throughout the city, sowing panic and destruction. Kain, witnessing this, realized that their world was on the brink of complete destruction. He called upon all the remaining warriors and leaders for a final stand. They had to fight for their city and their future. A battle ensued that no one had expected. The city, once thriving, was now a battlefield. People fought desperately, but the creatures that had emerged from the gates seemed invincible. At this moment, it became clear that their civilization was facing a threat they could never have anticipated. Chapter 11. Consequences. Months passed since the gates had closed behind Inon and his team. The city returned to its daily life, but a sense of unease and uncertainty lingered. The discovery of the gates and the events that had transpired beyond them had changed the people, both physically and mentally. And although the gates were closed, the memory of what lay beyond them continued to haunt them. Kain, despite his old age, felt the need to act. He understood that the danger had not disappeared but merely lay dormant. The Council of Elders convened to discuss the future of their people. Many believed that the events should be avoided, the gates sealed, and forgotten. But Inon and Leah insisted that this was not a solution, but merely postponing the inevitable. Leah, who had always possessed deep spiritual insight, proposed conducting rituals to attempt to connect with the forces they had awakened. She believed that only by understanding the nature of these forces could they find a way to protect themselves from them. Not everyone supported her, but ultimately it was decided to perform a purification ritual to help the people cope with their fear and restore spiritual balance. During this ritual, Leah fell into a deep trance and had a vision. In this vision, she saw ancient beings connected to the world beyond the gates. These beings seemed to know more about humans than humans knew about themselves. Leah realized that the gates were not just a passage to another world, but also a test for their civilization, a challenge they had to face. Inon led a group of engineers and scientists to study the artifacts and technologies found beyond the gates. They began developing new methods of defense and possible ways to interact with the gates. But each step forward brought new questions. One of the artifacts discovered in the ruins was a source of energy that could be used as a weapon or as a source of immense power capable of destroying everything around it. People began to feel changes in their society. Disagreements began to arise between those who wanted to seal the gates forever and forget about them, and those who believed they could be used to strengthen their civilization. These disagreements became increasingly apparent, and conflicts began to arise in the city. The Council of Elders understood that the situation was getting out of control. Kain proposed uniting the efforts of all the sages, scientists, and warriors to find a solution that would satisfy everyone. He called for unity, reminding them that only together could they overcome any difficulties, as they had throughout their history. Meanwhile, Asha, the elder and keeper of knowledge, began to study ancient manuscripts and symbols found on the artifacts. He concluded that these inscriptions might hold the key to understanding the nature of the gates and what lay beyond them. He realized that their civilization was on the verge of great changes and that this transition would be difficult and dangerous. At the same time, strange occurrences began to spread throughout the society. Some people claimed to have seen shadows moving in the night and heard voices that no one could explain. These phenomena heightened fears and suspicions, leading some to believe that the gates were cursed and had brought misfortune to their land. Kain convened all the leaders of the community to discuss the next steps. He proposed several possible paths: attempting to seal the gates forever, destroying the artifacts to prevent their use, or trying to control the forces they had awakened. Each of these paths was dangerous and could lead to catastrophic consequences. The council was divided. Some insisted on sealing and destroying everything related to the gates, while others, especially the scientists and engineers, saw in them enormous potential for development and protection of their civilization. The decision rested with Kain, Inon, and Leah, who understood the full responsibility for the future of their people. After long discussions and deliberations, Kain decided to give one more chance to study and control the gates, but with the caveat that if there was any hint of uncontrollable danger, they would have to close and seal them forever. This choice marked the beginning of a new stage in the history of their civilization, a stage full of risks and hopes. The gates began to open again, but now they knew that each opening could be the last. Chapter 12. The Great Threat. After Kain's decision to continue researching and attempting to control the forces beyond the gates, life in the city began to regain its former vibrancy. Scientists, engineers, and sages worked day and night, studying the artifacts and technologies found beyond the gates. Gradually, they achieved significant progress. They developed systems of protection that could contain the unstable energy of the artifacts and even began using part of that energy to improve life in the city. However, with each new discovery, the anxiety grew. The gates, once simply a passage to another world, now seemed to be something much more complex and dangerous. Inon felt this anxiety growing stronger. He, more than anyone, knew that their civilization was on a path with no return. While some saw the discoveries beyond the gates as a new source of power, others, including Leah, began to notice increasingly strange and disturbing signs. Leah continued to perform rituals, trying to understand what was happening beyond their perception. Her visions became darker and more confusing. She saw destruction, darkness overtaking light, and people losing their souls in their attempts to master what they could not understand. One day, during another experiment with the gates, an incident occurred that turned everything upside down. During an attempt to activate one of the artifacts found beyond the gates, a powerful surge of energy suddenly occurred. The protective systems failed, and the gates began to emit a strange radiation that quickly spread throughout the city. People began to experience strange symptoms. Some lost consciousness, others began to see strange visions, and still others felt an overwhelming sense of fear. Inon and his team immediately tried to shut down the artifact, but it was already too late. The radiation spread throughout the city, disrupting all mechanisms and causing mass panic. The city was plunged into chaos. People began to flee, abandoning their homes, fearing for their lives. Kain, who had remained in the center of events, tried to maintain order. He gathered all the elders and leaders to discuss the situation. It was clear that they could no longer control what they had awakened. The question was how to save their people and prevent a catastrophe. Leah, who by this time had felt a connection with the forces awakened beyond the gates, proposed conducting a sealing ritual. She believed that if they could communicate with the spirits of the ancients, they could find a way to close the gates and seal them forever, preventing further spread of the threat. However, Inon, who had been at the forefront of the scientific research, understood that simply closing the gates might not solve the problem. He proposed a radical plan: to destroy the gates and everything associated with them to eliminate the threat once and for all. But this also meant that they could lose all the knowledge and technology they had gained. The council was divided. Some supported Inon, believing that destroying the gates was the only way to avoid total catastrophe, while others, including Leah, believed they should try to find a peaceful solution through spiritual practices and rituals. In the end, it was decided to attempt both approaches. Leah began preparations for the sealing ritual, gathering all her followers and sages. Meanwhile, Inon and his team began preparing to destroy the gates in case the ritual failed. The night of the ritual was filled with tension and fear. The city was enveloped in anxious anticipation. Leah, surrounded by her helpers, began the complex ritual, calling upon the spirits of the ancients for help. The air was thick with energy, and it seemed that nature itself had paused in expectation. But at the moment when the ritual reached its climax, something unexpected happened. The gates began to vibrate, and an enormous wave of energy burst forth from them. Leah and her followers were knocked off their feet by this force, and it became clear that the ritual had not succeeded. Seeing this, Inon gave the order to begin the destruction of the gates. They activated a mechanism that was supposed to bring down the structure of the gates and destroy the artifacts. But at the moment the mechanism was triggered, the gates began to open, releasing something that was never meant to enter their world. From the gates emerged strange creatures, manifestations of darkness and chaos. They were similar to those Inon had seen in the world beyond the gates, but now they seemed even more powerful and terrifying. They began to spread throughout the city, causing panic and destruction. Kain, seeing this, realized that their world was on the brink of complete destruction. He called upon all the remaining warriors and leaders for a final stand. They had to fight for their city and their future. A battle ensued that no one had expected. The city, once thriving, was now a battlefield. People fought desperately, but the creatures that had emerged from the gates seemed invincible. At this moment, it became clear that their civilization was facing a threat they could never have anticipated. Chapter 13. The Moment of Choice. The city, which had once been a symbol of prosperity and unity, descended into chaos. The creatures that emerged from the gates brought darkness and destruction. The people, once confident in their future, were now fighting for survival, battling something they could not fully comprehend. Kain, Leah, Inon, and their allies faced a choice that would determine the fate of their civilization. Kain, fighting on the front lines, saw his people suffering tremendous losses. He understood that in their current state, they would not be able to hold out much longer. Their only chance for salvation was to destroy the gates and everything connected to them. But this decision was not easy. It meant losing all the knowledge they had gained and the possibility that these gates would remain closed forever, depriving them of access to new technologies and powers. Leah, who had tried to perform the ritual to close the gates, realized that the ancient forces they had tried to interact with would not easily retreat. Her visions became increasingly clear. She saw that these gates were not just a passage to another world but a kind of prison, holding back forces that could destroy their reality. She understood that their only chance was to find a way to seal the gates forever, but this could only be done through a great sacrifice. Inon stood before the most difficult decision of his life. He knew that if they did not destroy the gates now, the city would fall, and with it, their entire civilization. He also understood that this action could forever change their world. But he saw the destruction and chaos around him, and his duty was to protect his people at any cost. The Council of Elders gathered in the final hours to make the ultimate decision. Around them, the sounds of battle and destruction could be heard, and everyone knew that time was running out. Kain proposed a compromise. They should try to seal the gates, but if that failed, they must destroy them to save the remaining people. Leah proposed conducting one last ritual, combining the strength of the sages, scientists, and warriors. This ritual was meant to unite their knowledge and power to seal the gates forever. But she warned that this would require incredible strength and that the consequences could be unpredictable. Inon took command of the city's defense while Ya and the others prepared for the ritual. He knew they only had one chance, and he could not afford to make a mistake. All forces were focused on holding back the entities that had emerged from the gates and protecting those preparing for the ritual. When everything was ready, Leah, along with Kain and Asha, stood in the center of the ritual circle. The warriors and scientists surrounded them, ready for whatever would happen next. They began the ritual, calling upon the ancient spirits, the forces of nature, and the gates themselves to stop the destruction and seal the gates forever. The forces awakened by the ritual began to shake the earth. The air was filled with energy that seemed to tear reality apart. Leah felt their efforts beginning to affect the gates, but she also understood that it would not be easy. At that moment, Kain realized that Leah was going to sacrifice herself to complete the ritual. He tried to stop her, but she only smiled at him and said that this was their only chance. Suddenly, the earth began to tremble, and a final burst of energy erupted from the gates, engulfing Leah and everyone participating in the ritual. They disappeared in a blinding flash of light, and for a moment, there was complete silence. When the light dissipated, the gates began to slowly close, and the darkness that had emerged from them began to vanish. The creatures that had terrorized the city began to evaporate as if they had never existed. The city, which had been on the brink of destruction just minutes earlier, now stood in complete silence. Inon, seeing that the gates were closing, gave the order to his warriors to cease fire. They stood in shock, watching as the enormous structure slowly disappeared from their world. When the gates fully closed, they left behind only emptiness and silence. Kain, kneeling before the place where Leah had been, realized that she and all those who had participated in the ritual had sacrificed themselves to save their people. It was a bittersweet victory, and he knew that their civilization would never be the same again. After the battle ended and the gates were sealed, the city began to slowly recover. People realized the price they had paid for their survival. The sages and elders decided that the knowledge of the gates and their powers should be preserved, but that access to them should be strictly limited to ensure that no one ever attempted to open them again. Inon, returning from the battle, took on the responsibility of maintaining order in the city and rebuilding what had been destroyed. He knew that their civilization still faced many challenges, but he believed that they could overcome them if they worked together. Kain, having survived the loss of Leah and many others, understood that his time was coming to an end. He passed on his responsibilities to Inon, knowing that his people were in capable hands. Chapter 14. A New Dawn. Months passed since the day the gates were sealed forever, and the city of Kain and Narok once again found peace. But this peace came at a great cost. Leah and the other sages had sacrificed their lives to save their people from the threat they themselves had unleashed. The city took a long time to recover from the terrifying events, but life, despite everything, continued. Inon, to whom Kain had passed leadership, became the new leader of the people. Under his guidance, the city and its infrastructure began to be restored. People worked day and night, building new homes, strengthening the walls and rebuilding the trade routes. With each day, the city grew stronger and more prepared for new challenges. Kain, knowing that his time was coming to an end, retired to spend his final years in reflection and meditation. He understood that his place was now in the past, and the future belonged to the new generation. Before he left a final message to Inon. Always remember that the strength of the people lies in their unity and wisdom. Do not forget the lessons of the past, but strive for a bright future. One day, as the city was beginning to recover from the shocks, Asha proposed creating a place of remembrance where the knowledge and artifacts related to the gates would be preserved. This place was to serve as a reminder of the events that had changed their lives and as a warning to future generations. The Temple of Memory was built in the center of the city, and all the remaining artifacts, as well as chronicles written by the sages, were transferred there. Lia and the others who had sacrificed themselves to save the people were honored as heroes. Ceremonies were held in their memory, and their names became part of the legends passed down from generation to generation. The people knew that their sacrifice had not been in vain and that, thanks to them, their civilization had been given a second chance. Under Inon's leadership, a new era began. He understood that the past must remain in the past, but the lessons learned from it should guide them in the future. Inon initiated reforms aimed at developing education, science, and culture. He wanted his people to no longer rely on ancient technologies, but to build their future based on their own intelligence and hard work. One of the most important reforms was the introduction of the Council of Knowledge, which included representatives from all sectors of society. This council was to make decisions regarding the development of science, technology, and city governance. They also studied the ancient ruins and artifacts to better understand the past and prevent the repetition of mistakes. The city once again began to prosper, but this was a different kind of prosperity, one based on wisdom and caution. The people learned to value nature and their roots, striving to live in harmony with the world around them. They found a balance between development and the preservation of traditions. Years passed, and Inon grew old, just as Kain had once been. But he knew that his people were ready for the future, that they had passed through darkness and emerged stronger. In the final days of his life, he watched the sunrise over the rebuilt city, understanding that their civilization had survived the test of time and was now ready for new challenges. Epilogue. The city of Kain and Narek became a symbol of survival and rebirth. The stories of the great events related to the gates were passed down from generation to generation. The people learned to live in peace, based on the lessons of the past. The Temple of Memory became a center of knowledge where people came not only to honor the memory of the fallen, but also to learn, explore, and develop new ideas. Their civilization continued to grow and develop, spreading its knowledge and wisdom to other peoples. The people no longer sought power or to discover the unknown at any cost. They learned to value life, nature, and each other. The gates remained sealed, but their shadows were forever etched in history as a reminder that human greed and the pursuit of power could lead to destruction. And so, with each new day, with each new sunrise, the people of Kain and Narek continued their journey into the future, remembering that the most important things were unity, wisdom, and love for their people. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.